Ukraine says Russia has lost a brigade in its latest failed offensive, while President Zelensky has threatened to sink Russian ships in ports in Georgia. My name is Jerome Starkey. I'm the defence editor at The Sun newspaper, and this is your weekly roundup of the most important news of the war from Ukraine. We'll start with developments on the battlefield inside Ukraine. Now, after more than a year and a half of fighting, both sides have reached what appears to be a bloody and costly stalemate. Now, this doesn't mean there isn't movement, but it means the movement is slow and small and at significant cost. We understand that President Zelensky told Britain's Prime Minister Rishi Sunak today that Russia had lost a brigade in its failed offensives around the town of Avdiivka and Maritime. Now, these are both suburbs of Russian-occupied Donetsk, the capital of Ukraine's Donbass region, which has been in Russian hands since 2014. But Avdiivka and Maritime, just to the northwest and southwest of Donetsk, have become ferocious battlegrounds. Ukrainian officials say Russia has lost about 5,000 soldiers and at least 400 vehicles in the fighting in these towns. Now, if we look at why the fighting is taking place there, it's quite interesting because both sides trying to find, but particularly Ukraine, trying to find a breakthrough, of course, with its summer counteroffensive that has been grinding on in the south-central Zaporizhia region. Russia has responded with a counterattack in the northeastern Kupiansk region and more recently in Avdiivka and Maritime. Ukraine has crossed the Dnipro River to the south in Kherson and has made some gains on the left bank of the Dnipro River. Now, both sides in military terms are trying to complicate their enemies' decision-making processes. So trying to apply pressure in areas to stretch their forces more thinly and to deny each side the opportunity to concentrate that force in the area where they most want to try and break through. So for Ukraine, that breakthrough, they wanted to make that breakthrough in Zaporizhia, Russia putting pressure on them in Kupiansk, Avdiivka and Maritime. Ukraine responding, continuing with its main offensive, its main effort in Zaporizhia, but also we've seen offensives around Bakhmut and further south in Kherson. But from a broader point of view, there doesn't appear to be significant gain, significant movement on the front lines at the moment. Now, that doesn't mean this is a frozen conflict, and it doesn't mean there won't be movement on the front line, but it means for the time being, significant developments are few and far between. So that takes us to the second part of today's update, which is really the maritime aspect of this conflict, the naval war in the Black Sea, and President Zelenskyy's veiled threat to sink Russian warships in Georgia, in occupied Abkhazia, Russian-held Abkhazia in Georgia, in the southeastern end of the Black Sea. Now, this is significant because Russia has largely retreated from Sebastopol, its main naval headquarters in the Black Sea in occupied Crimea. It's moving its vessels eastwards. They've already been in the Russian port of Novorossiysk, and now the Kremlin has signaled they will be moving to ports in Abkhazia because Ukraine has successfully struck those vessels and the naval headquarters in Crimea. Crimea, because of the weapons at Ukraine's disposal, and indeed the tactics that it has developed through its special forces and intelligence services, have meant that Sebastopol, Crimea, is no longer a safe base for Russian forces. So in one sense, a victory for Ukraine because those ships are moving eastwards, and indeed President Zelensky saying that as Russian forces retreat to the eastern end of the Black Sea, his threat was, we will reach them everywhere. So not saying explicitly that he would launch attacks in Georgia, but he was making those comments in reference to the Russian decision to move its vessels to occupied Abkhazia. The Georgian government, by the way, has condemned that decision because the Georgian government opposes the Russian occupation of Abkhazia, just as the Ukrainian government opposed the Russian occupation of Donetsk. Meanwhile, also in the Black Sea, we've seen Russia reportedly dropping mines, maritime mines, bottom mines they've been described as, but dropping them from aircraft in the grain corridor that has been used by civilian vessels in the western end of the Black Sea. So whilst its vessels appear to be retreating, or at least its vessels appear to be moving their harbours eastwards, Russian aircraft still have reach, it seems, over the western end of the port. And of course, that will complicate efforts. Indeed, we understand the grain corridor that Ukraine has been trying to keep open has been closed briefly this week, and as and when exactly it reopens remains unclear. And then thirdly, let's look at the wider conflict, or at least how the Ukraine conflict is playing out in the wider world, indeed against the backdrop of what is happening in Israel, the war there between Israel and Hamas in the Gaza Strip, and increasing tensions between Israel and Hezbollah, the Iranian proxy force in southern Lebanon. Russian officials have welcomed a delegation from Hamas, accompanied by Iranian officials, to Moscow. Now, Israel has condemned this as a sign that Russia is promoting terrorism. It begs the question, what are Russia's interests in the Israel-Gaza war? Well, at the top level, anything that distracts the world, distracts the West, and distracts Ukraine's allies from the war in Ukraine is a good thing for Russia. We also know that Russia has been trying to fracture the Western alliance, the NATO-led Western alliance that has been supporting Ukraine, and potentially anything that can sow division among Ukraine and its Western allies would also support Russia, and they may see an opportunity to do that through the prism of the Israel-Hamas conflict. But equally, Russia is also in league with Iran, a key sponsor of Hamas and indeed Hezbollah. They're in league because Iran is one of the few countries that has been willing to supply Russia with arms during its war in Ukraine. Iran has been the source of the Shahed kamikaze one-way attack drones, which have proved so destructive and been a key part of Russia's sort of aerial bombardments, particularly last winter when Russia was focused on destroying Ukraine's energy infrastructure, ultimately a failed campaign to destroy Ukraine's energy infrastructure. So Russia and Iran are already in league. But of course, Russia has had its own problems with terrorism, and it will be very concerned. It will have to tread a very, very fine line if it's trying to play this game between, drawing Iran too far into a conflict. If the conflict in Israel sucks in regional countries, including Iran, then of course Iran's ability to support Russia is likely to be compromised. As ever, thank you very much for your questions. If you do have questions, please write them in the comments and we will endeavour to answer them in next week's episode. Our questions from last week: do we think that President Putin orchestrated the Hamas attack on Israel on October 7th? I have not seen any conclusive evidence to suggest that Russia had a hand in either planning, orchestrating or triggering this attack. The nature of these conflicts is that there are always, people always have, different parties have many interests, vested interests, veiled interests, and it's very difficult sometimes to get at the truth. I would urge you to, suspect everything but believe nothing until it is absolutely confirmed and factual, because the nature of particularly this conflict in Israel and Gaza, and indeed the conflict in Ukraine with Russia, is that truth is precious and very hard to come by. As I say, I haven't seen that evidence. I have said before, and I'll say it again, that Russia does have a vested interest in distracting the world and the West and Ukraine's allies from the war in Ukraine, and so does stand to gain potentially from what is happening in Israel and in the Gaza Strip. But it's a very high-risk strategy were that Russia's plan and could yet backfire. Question number 2 was, why does Ukraine appear to be focused on destroying Russian armour, vehicles, tanks, rather than the crews that are inside them? This is clearly based on looking at the footage we've seen, the drone footage of successful strikes on Russian hardware. Often in the aftermath you see the crew managing to escape. It's probably a combination of reasons. I mean, most importantly, expensive high-tech vehicles like tanks are harder to produce, harder to replace than personnel. Russia has at its disposal a potentially huge pool of soldiers. Now, you know, it takes time to train soldiers, it takes longer to train skilled cavalry soldiers who'd be operating complicated armoured vehicles, but ultimately the vehicles themselves are perhaps the more precious, more important military target, but also they are bigger targets which are easier for sophisticated munitions to find and destroy. Once those vehicles, I mean, often when those vehicles are destroyed, the people inside them are tragically killed as well. But in a situation where the crew dismount and manage to escape, it would then require probably a very different kind of weapon system to try and target those soldiers once they're on foot, once they're out of the vehicles. For example, if a HIMARS missile had destroyed an armoured vehicle and the crew had dismounted, you might then want something like airburst artillery or an airburst missile to try and get the soldiers. It's more complicated, it's more resource intensive, plenty of people, plenty of soldiers. I mean, far too many on both sides are dying. You know, that is happening. It may also be that perhaps those videos are too gruesome to be shared, which is why we're perhaps seeing more of the videos of armour being destroyed rather than individuals. And finally, is Ukraine continuing to push through the Russian defensive line? Well, I think we've probably already answered this slightly. Not really. They are continuing to push at it. In places they are continuing to get through it, but it's incremental. It's a few kilometres, it's a few hundred metres usually at a time. Hamlets, villages, that's the main focus of that in south-central Zaporizhia. That's where the main Russian defensive line is. Of course, Ukraine is still making incremental progress around Bakhmut, which for many months was the epicenter of the war, and it has made more significant progress, certainly in terms of territory, down in southern Kherson. But of course, in Kherson, Ukraine has crossed the river. It's crossed the Dnipro River. It holds the right bank. It now has forces on the left bank. It will face the same challenge that Russian soldiers, indeed Russian generals, faced around this time last year, which is, can it resupply them? Now, Russia made the decision in late October, November last year to withdraw its forces from the right bank of the river because it felt it couldn't supply them. Ukraine is moving infantry across the river. It's done this largely on small boats, speedboats, rafts, dinghies. It had some significant successes pushing the Russian forces there backwards. Whether or not that is sustainable, whether or not they can turn that into a bigger offensive, indeed threaten the land bridge towards the top of Crimea, that remains to be seen. Thank you very much for watching. As ever, please make your questions if you have them in the comments, and look forward to seeing you again next week.